Hey there. Welcome back to another quiet evening together. Tonight, we're stepping into a world of pages and memories, where the soft rustle of bookshelves still echoes with laughter long past. The story begins with something small, a dusty old library card, yellowed at the edges, slipping from the pages of a forgotten novel. Leonard hadn't been to the library in years. Life, as it does, moved on. But as he pulled that book from the shelf and the card fluttered out onto the floor, he froze. The name written there in faded ink brought a warmth to his chest and a stillness to the room. Emily. She had worked at the library all those years ago, gentle, kind, always tucking a poem into his borrowed stack or sharing a knowing smile over a shared passage. She never said much, and neither did he. But in the hush of that library, something had bloomed quietly, tenderly, and without ever asking for anything in return. Each book Leonard touched now felt like it held a memory. A whisper of her laughter, a brush of her sleeve as they passed in the aisle. Stories weren't just on the pages, they were in the space between them, in the pauses, in the glances that lingered just a moment too long. It wasn't a grand love, or one built on declarations and promises. It was softer than that. It lived in silence, in the smell of old pages, in the afternoon light that streamed through stained glass windows and painted the floor with colors. It was a love that never had a beginning or an end, just a presence, steady and unspoken. And now, with this card in his hand, Leonard could almost hear her voice again. The way she used to say his name, low and kind, like she was letting him in on a secret. Before we begin, if these soft stories bring you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me, is there someone you remember quietly? Someone who passed through your life like a chapter you never quite finished? Now, let your eyes close. Let the hush of the library wrap around you. And let's follow Leonard back to the shelves, back to where it all began, with a name, a card, and a memory that never quite let go. The library had changed, but only just. The corners were still dusty, and the air still carried that earthy scent of paper and time. Leonard stood in the doorway a little longer than he meant to, letting the silence settle over him like a shawl. He hadn't come looking for anything that day. Just a bit of quiet, maybe, or a place to sit where no one needed anything from him. He walked slowly past the familiar shelves, trailing his fingers along the worn wooden edge. The titles were mostly the same, some newer covers, perhaps, but the same old friends stood faithfully where they always had. It was in the fiction aisle, the third row on the left, that his hand landed on the book, Leaves of Grass. A collection he'd read years ago, back when poetry still felt like something you could carry in your pocket. He pulled it gently from the shelf, opened it to a random page, and there it was, the card. It slipped out without a sound, landing at his feet. He bent down slowly, knees protesting just a bit, and picked it up. It was pale with age, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still unmistakable. Emily had this beautiful looping curse of each letter shaped like she cared for it. On the card, her name, the date, and the title of the book. Nothing more. And yet everything. Leonard held the card for a long moment before opening the book again. The page it had marked was a poem they had read together once, years ago, when he'd been too nervous to say much, and she'd filled the silence with verses. He could still hear her voice in his mind, steady, soft, each word landing with the weight of something meant just for him. That day had been raining, he remembered now. They had both stayed late, the storm outside keeping them in. She'd made tea in the tiny back room, brought two mismatched mugs, and sat beside him as they read aloud. The library was nearly empty, just the hum of the building and their voices threading between the books. They hadn't spoken much after the reading, but when she handed him the book to check out, she had tucked the card inside. "You might find it again when you need it most," she'd said with a little smile. At the time, he thought it was just a quip. Now, it felt like a message from the past, a gentle reminder that not all things are truly lost. He looked around the library now, wondering if anyone else remembered her. She hadn't worked there long, a year, maybe 2, but in that time, she had become part of the very soul of the place. She had this way of listening, really listening, like whatever you said was the most important thing in the world. Leonard found himself smiling, not with joy exactly, but with that warm, bittersweet kind of smile that comes when memory wraps around you like an old quilt. He walked over to the reading table, the same one where they used to sit, and lowered himself into the chair, the card still in his hand, the book in the other. He read that poem again, this time aloud, his voice a little rougher now, a little slower, but the words came back just the same. There's something about poetry, he thought. It doesn't age. It waits for you. Just like Emily had waited that day, with tea and a poem and a look he didn't understand until much later. The library was quiet as ever. A few students at the far end, a librarian is shelving returns. But for Leonard, it was as if the shelves had leaned in closer, listening. The room held its breath with him. And just like that, the years folded in on themselves. The past didn't feel so far away anymore. It was there in ink and paper, in the air, in the stillness. And somewhere, perhaps in another town, or tucked into another life, Emily might still be reading, still writing her name on little cards, still folding verses into the hands of those who needed them, even if they didn't know it yet. He stayed there a while longer, thumbing through more pages. His eyes landed on a line he hadn't noticed before. It read, "We were together. I forget the rest." He read it again, slower. "We were together. I forget the rest." And he thought, yes. That was exactly it. The memory of being near her, of sharing something without naming it, of simply existing in the same breath. That was what mattered. The details had faded, but not the feeling. Leonard took a small notepad from his coat pocket and wrote that line down. He didn't know why, just that it felt like something worth keeping. Something true. Emily had arrived one autumn, a quiet presence among the rust-colored leaves and the crisp promise of change in the air. Leonard remembered the first time he saw her, not in vivid detail, but as a feeling, a softness that entered the room with her, a calm that settled over the stacks like a wool blanket. She didn't speak much at first. She was polite, of course, with a kind of manners that never seemed forced, but she was mostly absorbed in her work cataloging, reshelving, and occasionally jotting something into a leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. Leonard was a regular by then, not for any particular reason, other than the library felt like a sanctuary from the noise of everything else. At first, their conversations were nothing more than nods, a soft, "good afternoon," the occasional shared glance when a book cart squeaked too loudly. But little moments began to gather. He noticed how she always paused at the poetry section, as if it were a chapel. How she lingered over the spines with a reverence reserved for something sacred. One day, without thinking, he mentioned a line from Frost something about paths, and wood sand, she looked up, with a spark in her eyes. "You like poetry?" she asked, her voice quiet but sure. He nodded. "The kind that doesn't ask too much of me." That made her smile. The best kind. From then on, it became a silent rhythm. He would come in, and there she'd be somewhere between fiction and nonfiction, or perched behind the desk, a pen between her fingers. Occasionally, he'd find a small slip of paper tucked inside a book he borrowed. Just a line, a poem, a thought. One read, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." He kept that one in his wallet for years. They never had what you'd call long conversations, but they had presence, shared silences that weren't empty, but full of something tender and unspoken. They'd read together sometimes. She'd pick a book, usually something older, lyrical, a little forgotten, and he'd listen while she read aloud, her voice like honey over warm toast. He remembered how she curled her legs beneath her on the bench, how she wore sweaters a size too big, how her fingers moved along the lines of text as if tracing something precious. And then there was the afternoon of the haiku game. The power had gone out, a storm rolling in, and the lights flickered into darkness. Instead of panicking, she lit a few candles the library kept for emergencies and suggested they write haiku to pass the time. They sat across from each other at the reference desk, challenging one another in whispers. 5, 7, 5, over and over, each one sillier than the last, until they were both stifling laughter in the flickering glow. He remembered one she wrote, hastily scribbled on a torn piece of a checkout slip. Books whisper softly. Between the hush of heartbeats, you sit close, breathing. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, just looked at her, and she looked back, and they let the silence carry what words couldn't. They never dated, never declared anything. Life was complicated. He was helping care for his mother back then, working nights. She had her own responsibilities, and maybe her own reasons for keeping some distance. But even without a title, what they had was real, and in its own quiet way, it was enough. One winter evening, just before closing, she handed him a book of Pablo Neruda poems. Inside, she'd marked a passage. "I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees." He remembered tracing those words with his thumb, heart too full to speak. And when he looked up, she was already walking away, coat in hand, her scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon in the wind. That was Emily. Not grand, not dramatic, just real, present. A whisper of something beautiful and fleeting. She had a habit of humming when shelving Booksoft, familiar melodies that Leonard couldn't name, but that felt like lullabies. He once asked her about it, and she shrugged gently. "Old family songs," she said. Nothing special, but they were. He remembered those tunes long after she was gone. Sometimes he'd catch a few notes in passing, through a window, or on the radio, and for a moment, he'd be back among the shelves, watching her move between the aisles like she belonged to them. They shared holidays in small ways. A gingerbread cookie she left for him near Christmas, wrapped in wax paper with a ribbon and no note. A dried leaf pressed into the front cover of a book he checked out in October, shaped like a perfect star. He never brought them up. Neither did she. But the messages were always clear. They even had a ritual of trading quotes, scribbled on the back of old catalog cards. One of hers read, "Love sought is good, but given unsought is better. He had stared at that one a long time. He never told her how much she meant to him. He wasn't sure he could have, even if the words had been there. But there was a kind of beauty in the unspoken, in the glance held a beat too long, in the hand that brushed his just briefly, in the book returned a day late because he hadn't quite been ready to let go of her mark inside. It wasn't a story of mischances. It was a story of what they had, exactly as it was fragile, sacred, and enough. There are loves that are shouted from rooftops, that spill over with letters and proclamations, fireworks and promises. And then there are the quieter ones, the ones that nest in the heart like a bird in the rafters, unseen but deeply felt. Leonard's love for Emily had always been the second kind. It didn't come in a moment. It didn't arrive all at once, sweeping him off his feet. It was built gently, layer by layer, like morning light easing into a room. It grew in glances exchanged across shelves, in books shared and poems whispered, in the space where their words trailed off and the silence filled with everything unsaid. He remembered one afternoon in spring. She had brought in a bouquet of wildflowers, simple, mismatched, beautiful. She placed them in a chipped mug on the front desk, and when he admired them, she looked surprised. "I picked them on the way here," she said. "Didn't think anyone would notice." "I notice everything you bring," he replied. She had blushed then, just a faint pink across her cheeks, but didn't say anything back. Still, the silence buzzed with meaning. They didn't need to speak it. It was there, humming between them like a shared secret. Another time, they found themselves alone in the library during a snowstorm. The streets were blanketed in white, the world outside muffled and still. She made cocoa from a stash she kept in her desk drawer, and they sat near the radiator with steaming mugs in hand, watching the snow fall through the tall windows. He had nearly said it then. The words had pressed at his lips, steady and insistent. But instead, he asked about her favorite book. "I don't have one," she said after a pause. "Books are like people. You can love more than one for different reasons." He smiled, but inside, something tugged. She always had a way of answering just slightly askew from what he was really asking. Their love, if you could call it that, was defined not by what they did, but by what they didn't. They didn't meet outside the library. They didn't exchange numbers or make plans. There were no embraces, no farewells, just moments. He once asked her, very gently, if she ever thought about leaving the town. She looked at him, long and slow, before answering. "I think about staying," she said. He never asked again. They had a rhythm, and he was afraid of breaking it. Like a fragile melodeon wrong note, and the whole song could disappear. He often wondered if she felt the same. If she held the same ache in her chest when they parted ways each evening. If she too lay awake sometimes, thinking about the way their shoulders almost touched when they sat side by side. There were moments when it felt close, so close. Like when she rested her hand briefly over his to pass him a book. Or the time they laughed too loudly together over an old detective novel, and she covered her mouth with her sleeve, then glanced at him with a softness in her eyes that made his breath catch. But always, the moment would pass. The world would right itself, and they would return to the comfort of their careful dance. It wasn't fear exactly that held him back. It was reverence. He didn't want to name what they had and risk reducing it. Some things, he believed, were more powerful when left undefined. He remembered the last line she ever wrote to him. It was tucked inside a copy of Jane Eyre, a book he'd never thought she'd favor, too brooding for her light. But on the final page, in her neat cursive, she'd written, "There is no happiness like that of being loved by someone who knows all your flaws and still stays." He had reread that line 1,000 times, wondered if it was a confession, wondered if it was just a gift of words. He never found out. There was also the moment in early summer, just before the school holidays. They had stayed late to help reorganize the history section, dusty and neglected. It was hot that day, the kind of thick, pressing heat that made you speak more slowly. She had tied her hair up in a loose knot, strands falling around her face, and her blouse was smudged with chalk from old shelf labels. As they sat on the floor, laughing at a book titled Napoleon's Diet, their shoulders touched just lightly, but neither pulled away. It wasn't much, but it was the longest contact they'd ever held. And in that single unspoken moment, Leonard felt everything. The comfort, the ache, the longing, the impossibility. He wanted to hold her hand. Just once. Just to see how it felt. But he never did. Because once you start, you have to keep going. And neither of them seemed ready for what came after that. It wasn't that he didn't have courage. He had faced far greater fears in life illness, loss, loneliness. But this was different. This was delicate. A wrong step could shatter what had grown so perfectly in silence. Sometimes he wondered if love only ever lived in the potential, if it thrived in the maybe, the almost, the nearly. With Emily, the unsaid carried more weight than anything he might have uttered. Their pauses were poems, their sidelong glances, confessions. And even now, decades later, that memory brought peace. No regret, just the quiet knowledge that he had loved someone purely, gently, without needing anything in return. It wasn't a grand farewell. No train station scene, no tearful confessions in the rain. When Emily left, it was as gentle and quiet as she had always been. Leonard hadn't known she was going. Not officially. There were no goodbye parties, no letters of departure pinned to the staff corkboard. Just a shift in the air, the kind you don't notice until it's already passed. One Monday morning, he arrived at the library and found someone else at the front desk. A young woman with nervous hands and a name tag that read, Paula. He scanned the shelves, the back corners, the break room window, but Emily wasn't there. She left last week. Paula offered without being asked, as if sensing his question before he could ask it. Something about family out west. She said it all happened quickly. Leonard nodded, said thank you, and walked to his usual table. He sat for a while, pretending to read, but the words blurred into nothing. The silence of the library, once comforting, now felt like it was pressing in on him. Too loud, too empty. There was no closure. No moment to say all the things he hadn't said. No last glance to hold on to. Just absence. And in its place, echoes. He returned the next day, and the next. Not hoping she would be there, but needing to sit where she used to sit, to walk the aisles she once moved through. It felt like tracing a memory with his fingertips, like following footprints in the snow that had already begun to melt. Weeks passed. The bouquet of wildflowers on the desk wilted, and no one replaced it. The little poems she used to leave behind stopped appearing. Her scent, something like lavender and old paper, faded from the room. He thought about writing, about asking someone where she had gone, but he didn't. Part of him didn't want to chase her into a world where she might no longer belong to the library, to their shared silence. He preferred to keep her where she was in memory, still holding a book, still smiling at him from across the stacks. Sometimes, he thought about what he would have said if he'd known. Stay, maybe. Or, you made the quiet feel like music. Or simply, thank you. But in truth, he wasn't sure he would have said anything at all. Their bond had never needed words. In the weeks that followed, he found pieces of her left behind. A pencil was tucked between the pages of an old novel. A folded napkin with the start of a haiku. Some days I wonder. That was all. Nothing more. As if she had vanished mid-thought. He kept that napkin in his wallet, next to the catalog card with her handwriting. Every once in a while, he would catch himself talking to her in his mind, sharing the lines of poetry he came across, commenting on books he knew she would have loved. It was a comfort, like keeping a part of her alive. And then, one rainy afternoon, he found the Neruda book again. It had been reshelved, misfiled under gardening. When he opened it, the pressed cherry blossom was still inside, fragile and brown with age. On the margin of one page, in her hand, "This one is yours." He ran his finger over the words, closed the book, and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few tears, warm and slow, for everything that was and wasn't. For a love that never had a beginning or an end. For a goodbye that never needed to be spoken to be understood. Over time, Leonard stopped waiting for her to return. The ache softened into something gentler, something woven into the fabric of his days. He still visited the library, still walked the same paths, but he no longer searched each corner with hope. Instead, he simply listened for silence, for the memory of her humming, for the whisper of paper sliding across wood. He began leaving little notes of his own, not poems exactly, more like thoughts, sentences he wished she could hear. He tucked them inside books, behind jackets and flaps. Maybe no one would ever find them, but maybe someone would. He liked the idea of continuing the pattern they had started, of giving the library a little life, a little echo of what once was. One afternoon, years later, a young librarian approached him with a puzzled smile. "Did you write this?" she asked, holding out a piece of paper he recognized instantly. On it, in his neat, careful script, "Some people don't leave. They become part of the place." He just smiled. "Maybe." She nodded. "It's beautiful. We're thinking of making a little display. Found a whole stack of these tucked into old novels." Leonard chuckled softly. Sounds like something she would have liked. He didn't explain who she was. He didn't need to. As he walked home that evening, cane tapping lightly on the sidewalk, he thought about how love doesn't always have to be loud or finished, or even mutual to be real. Sometimes, love is just showing up, sitting quietly beside someone, letting them know, even without words, that they matter. Emily had done that for him, and in his own quiet way, maybe he had done that for her too. Years passed. Seasons turned over quietly, like pages in a worn book. Leonard aged gently, as if time itself had decided to treat him with care. He didn't go to the library as often anymore. His steps were slower now, his hands more careful. But there were days when something inside him stirred a pull, not unlike the turning of a tide in, he'd find himself once again walking the familiar path down the elm-lined street toward the old brick building. It looked the same. Almost. The paint on the trim was fresher, and the sign above the door had been replaced. But the scent hit him the moment he stepped inside that comforting blend of dust, wood, and wisdom. The reading tables were still in the same place, though now they had outlets built into them. The shelves had new labels, some brighter colors, but many of the books still wore the same cracked spines. And in the quiet hum of the space, Leonard could almost hear her. He moved slowly, pausing at the poetry section. The books had shifted positions, but Leaves of Grass was still there. He opened it gently. No card fell out this time, but that was all right. He didn't need one anymore. He wandered to the fiction section, third row, left side, the spot where he'd first found the card. The memory flickered through him like warm light. He placed his hand on the shelf, as if grounding himself in the past. A librarian walked by and offered him a smile. "Need help finding anything?" "No," Leonard said softly. "Just visiting an old friend." He sat down at his old table. The wood was polished now, and newer chairs were placed around it. But in his mind, the old grooves and scratches were still there, like the scars on a familiar hand. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper he had written weeks ago and read over many times. On it was a small note, nothing grand, just a thought. "I loved someone once, without ever saying it out loud, and it was enough." He stood, walked to the poetry shelf, and tucked it between the pages of a Neruda collection. He didn't know if anyone would find it. He didn't mind if no one did. The act itself was enough. As he made his way toward the exit, he paused one last time at the front desk. Paula was gone. The current librarian was someone new, a young man who looked up and gave Leonard a nod of recognition. "Back again?" he asked. Leonard smiled. Some places never stop calling you. Outside, the air was cool and still. Leaves floated gently down from the trees, spinning slowly in the breeze. He pulled his coat a little tighter, not from the cold, but from the quiet weight of memory pressing against his chest. He walked slowly past the park bench where he once sat and read aloud to Emily. He paused there too, not to sit, just to remember. He could almost see her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, legs tucked up beside her, hair catching the golden light of late afternoon. She would look up, meet his eyes, and smile in that way that made everything else fade into the background. Now, in the golden hush of the present, he found that smile again, not in the air around him, but in himself. It lived there now, not like a wound, but like a whisper. Some people build lives with each other. Others build moments. And if you're lucky, those moments can fill a lifetime. Back home, Leonard poured himself a cup of tea. He sat by the window with a book open in his lap, though he wasn't reading. His eyes drifted toward the dusk sky. Clouds tinged lavender and rose. He wasn't lonely. Not exactly. There was a presence in his solitude of fullness that came from having loved deeply, even quietly. He looked down at the book, turned a page, and smiled. Emily had been a chapter in his life, yes. But more than that, she'd been the feeling between the lines, the heartbeat, and the quiet, the warmth behind the words. And in that, she had never really left at all. And so, Leonard's story quietly closes not with a dramatic ending, but with the gentle turning of a final page. Some stories don't need resolution. They don't require answers, or reunions, or grand declarations. They simply are. Like rain on the roof, or the last line of a poem that doesn't rhyme, but still feels whole. Leonard never saw Emily again. He never heard from her, never learned what came of her life. And still, her presence remained with him, rooted not in the facts of their connection, but in its feeling. Sometimes, the heart remembers in silence, in the smell of an old book, in the hush of a quiet room, in the echo of laughter you thought you'd forgotten. That was how Emily stayed with him, not as a ghost or a dream, but as a truth, quiet and real. In loving her the way he did, without ownership, without expectation, Leonard had discovered something rare. A kind of love that didn't need to be named to be known, that didn't need to be spoken to be heard. He never regretted not telling her, because in every shared silence, in every look across the stacks, in every poem passed between pages, he had told her in his own way. Years later, when people asked if he had ever fallen in love, he would just smile softly and say, "Once, a very long time ago, in a place where the stories whispered and time stood still." That was enough. He would sometimes walk by the library even when he didn't plan to go in. Just seeing it brought warmth to his chest, like running a finger along the spine of an old friend. It reminded him that real love doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be true. He kept the catalog card, the one with her handwriting, kept it in a small wooden box along with a pressed flower and a few of the little poems she'd left for him. And every so often, he would take them out, one by one, and read them aloud, not to remember, but to feel. There's a kind of comfort in carrying someone with you through time, not as a shadow or a weight, but as a light. Emily had been that light, and in the soft glow of her memory, Leonard had found peace. Now, sitting by the window with the last light of day painting the walls in soft gold, Leonard felt content. He had lived a life full of quiet beauty, and in his heart he had carried someone who once made a library feel like a world. To you, listening now perhaps, there's someone you remember quietly too. A friend, a love, a moment that passed through your life like a breeze through the trees. Maybe you never told them how much they meant. Maybe you didn't need to. Memory is its own kind of love. Gentle, lasting, enough. So let this story settle around you now like a blanket. Let it warm the corners of your heart that haven't been touched in a while. Let it remind you that the love you gave, the kindness you shared, the quiet presence you offered, those things never vanish. They linger. They grow roots. They live on in someone's silence, in someone's soft smile at a thought they can't explain. If this story brought you peace tonight, I invite you to gently like the video and subscribe for more soft stories just like this one. And in the comments below, if you feel like it, tell me, who do you still carry in your heart? What quiet love has never left you? Now, close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Let the hush of memory and warmth wrap around you like a favorite old coat. And sleep well, knowing that you've loved, that you've mattered, that even the quietest hearts leave echoes. Good night.